what I'm going to cover today is really a collection of resources that we have developed here at Purdue with the help of the Nature Conservancy that's really aiming at helping landowners and managers understand, monitor, and address deer impacts to forests. And if you want to kind of follow along with this presentation or see all the resources that I'm going to talk about during the webinar, you can copy this QR code, or you can use the link that Chris is going to drop into the chat to access the slides for this presentation, but also links to the resources that we'll cover during the webinar. So to start, we'll just kind of talk about a broad overview of what the problem is with deer, or what the potential problem is with deer and their impact to forests. Then we'll kind of go into some research that we've been doing here at Purdue related to deer densities across Indiana, but also how deer impact forest environments throughout the state. And then we'll talk about the collection of resources that can help you all as landowners or managers kind of understand and address those deer issues. So deer are what's called, are considered a keystone species, which means that how they browse and how they interact with the landscape impacts not only forest vegetation, but also wildlife habitat. And deer are concentrate selectors, which means that they're not going out there and just randomly eating the food and plants that they find. They are selectively browsing certain plant species and certain parts of plants, right? So they have certain plant species that they really like that are kind of like ice cream plants to them. And then they're also kind of selectively browsing certain parts of the plants, like the young tender growth on woody plants, even on herbaceous plants as well. Not to say that they won't eat a wide variety of things, but when given a choice, they're going to pick their favorites just like we'd pick our favorites off of a buffet. And so this browsing that deer do, so through their diet selection, through their browsing, this can have both positive and negative impacts on our forest environments. And it's important to think about these three questions when we consider deer and their relationship to our forest environments. First is, what impact do they cause? We're going to cover that here in a minute. Also, we need to consider, when are deer a problem, right? So deer impact can be positive and negative. When is that threshold of when deer become problematic as far as limiting plant regeneration and tree regeneration and other types of forest aspects? And then, if deer are a problem, what are our management options to control deer and control deer browse? We're going to talk about all three of those questions as we go through. Of course, you can't do a deer impact talk without a few pictures of what deer impact looks like. And so there's a collection of species on there and signs of deer browse. So bonus points for folks if you can guess the species correctly in those four pictures. So on the top we have a maple stump. So deer really like to browse on stumps, and they will really hammer stumps if deer populations are high. The species on the very right there, that is white ash. Not a lot of overstory white ash left because of the intermal bore, but plenty of ash regeneration and ash seedlings and saplings around, and deer will browse those pretty heavily. The species there in the middle is sweet Sicily, which is a understory herbaceous plant that's commonly browsed by deer. And then the species there on the left is red oak, which is northern red oak, which is one of those ice cream plants for deer that they will skip over a lot of other stuff just to browse the red oak. So it's important to think about what impacts deer cause. Well, when deer are within the carrying capacity, when there is enough resources on the landscape to support the amount of deer that are on the landscape, or there's less deer on the landscape than there are resources to support them, deer can actually have a positive impact on plant diversity. And this is because they can selectively browse woody plants, which gives more room for grasses and wildflowers or forbs to grow. And so you can actually have an increase in plant diversity under kind of a low to moderate browse level with deer. The problems become when deer are beyond their carrying capacity And this has kind of been a chronic issue, especially in the eastern United States, states like Pennsylvania, New York, and states like that, where they've had chronic overpopulations of deer for years and years and years. And here in the Midwest, we're not immune from it. We can reach back and look at some of the state parks that we have in Indiana through the 80s and 90s. As deer started to repopulate those state parks, there was no hunting or other forms of management in the parks, and the diversity and the browse lines, like you see in this picture, were very common in Indiana state parks through the 80s and early 90s. And so we saw a lot of things. We saw a real change in the plant diversity in those forests. We saw a reduction in tree regeneration and growth. Now in some areas we're starting to see an increase in invasive plant species. A couple of them that are tied to deer impacts would be Japanese stiltgrass and garlic mustard. Those are two species that deer really do not eat at all, and so through deer browsing native plants, they make more room for the invasive plants. And then you get this change in forest structure like you see in this picture here. So we had all of these signs and symptoms in a lot of our state parks across Indiana, but through the controlled management of hunting on state parks since the 90s, a lot of our state parks have hunts every year. They've really been able to kind of shift some of those problems and impact of deer, control the deer populations a little better, and now they've actually seen an increase in plant diversity, better regeneration and growth of trees, and then a better forest structure. So we can kind of classify deer impacts in different bins or categories, and this is what I would classify as low deer impact. These are all large flower trillium, which is probably one of the species that deer would most like to eat in the spring. It's one of our spring ephemeral plants. And if your woods looks like this, then you do not have a deer problem. And that's because you only get trillium like this in areas that have low deer browse and low deer pressure because they selectively browse those trilliums. So if you have trilliums like this across your woodland, and this picture's from northern Indiana, then you're probably pretty set. But I imagine most landowners don't have an abundance of trillium like this in their woodland. You can start to see kind of moderate levels of deer impact when you start to see reduction in tree growth and regeneration. Again, this is a stump sprout from a maple, and this is what we call hedging, to where if a tree was to fall over or a tree was to be cut down, essentially the deer browse so heavily on that plant that they never allow it to get outside of the reach of deer, which is generally 5 or 6 feet. So they just kind of keep it perennial and keep it bushy and never let it grow and regenerate into a tree. I already mentioned garlic mustard, but garlic mustard infestations can go hand in hand with high deer impact because deer are preferentially browsing a lot of our native species, which allows species like garlic mustard to invade areas and have less pressure from native plant species. And another example of really high deer pressure are these examples of browse lines. And so essentially a browse line is every piece of vegetation, leafy matter, is consumed as high as a deer can reach, or most of it, right? So here you can say this is probably around 4 feet, but when deer stand on their hind legs, which they often do, they can browse as high as 5 to 6 feet. So you'll see this kind of 5 to 6, basically 0 to 5 or 6 feet gap in the forest structure where you can kind of see all the way through the forest beneath 6 feet because the deer have consumed so much vegetation. I would say that in a lot of private woodlands and a lot of even our state parks now, browse lines are not as common as they once was, but we still do find them out, especially on unhunted properties. So if your woods looks like this, you might have a deer problem. Guaranteed you probably have a deer problem. And just to kind of show you a few other examples, if you're trying to reforest a site or take a site from a crop field and do tree plantings, this is an example from one of our research farms at Purdue where we planted 2 tree plantings the same exact year and same exact time, and we fenced the one on the left, and we did not fence the one on the right. And this is only a few years after the planting. So you can kind of see how bad the deer impacts were on this property, to where you can hardly see many of the tree species there on the right. Now, some of the tree species have came through now, but it's definitely looks a lot different than the site does on the left. And now these trees on the left here are tall enough that we've completely removed that deer fence, and the trees are safe from deer browse. So now we know kind of what impacts deer have. Now we need to think about what causes deer impacts, and what things are we thinking about, are we considering when we're talking about how deer impacts vary across the landscape. So a very simple question there for you. I'll have you answer in the chat, and maybe Chris can kind of tell me the answers. Do you all agree with the statement that more deer equals more damage or more impact?
So we're getting a lot of yeses and some depends so far.
All right. They beat me to the two-word biologist answer I was going to use. And so really the answer to that question is it depends. It depends on a lot of things. More deer does not always equate to more damage, because there's different things that kind of mediate and moderate deer damage across the landscape. So the answer to that question is it depends, which always isn't the best answer, but in complex systems, there's always complex answers. So what factors influence deer browse? Well, number of deer does influence deer browse, but it's not always the most important factor. Some other things that influence deer browse are the plants to choose from, and then the landscape characteristics. So which factors are more or most important? The answer to that question is going to depend on your landscape and your given situation. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those different factors influence deer impacts. And so we can think of deer impact as both a deer problem, but also a food problem, right? So we can have too many deer, but we can also have too little food on the landscape, which if there's too little food on the landscape and too many deer, then the deer impacts are going to be more. But if we have plenty of food on the landscape and we still have a lot of deer, then maybe those impacts are going to be less, because we have enough food to feed the deer that are there. So we kind of had this question in Indiana of what are deer impacts to the forest? What does our deer population look like across the state? And how are deer impacting our forest ecosystems? So in 2018, we started a 3-year project called the Integrated Deer Management Project, which was a study across Indiana that combined deer population and habitat condition information with public perceptions of deer as a way to improve deer management throughout the state. So we kind of measured 3 different things in a variety of ways. We measured deer density, we measured deer impact of woody plants in forested environments, and then we measured people's attitudes towards deer and deer management. I'm going to cover kind of this middle one here and a little bit about the deer density, but this map on the right kind of shows you the areas of the state that we worked in. And so for those of you familiar with Indiana, where my cursor is right there is about where I'm sitting currently in West Lafayette, Indiana. And this is a row crop landscape, and you'll see in a minute most of our forested areas are around river corridors. This where my cursor is, right about here, and I'm going to be a little off, is about Bloomington, Indiana, where the other school in Indiana is, and that landscape is a very forested landscape, primarily forested. This block up here is a little bit north of Fort Wayne, Indiana, or around Fort Wayne, Indiana, and it is what is considered our lake country. So it's a lot of glacial lakes, a lot of rolling topography, a good mix of forest, ag land, pastures, and other vegetation types. So in order to kind of understand how deer impact differed across the landscape and how browse intensity, so how much of the vegetation deer were browsing across the landscape, we tested several different methods for monitoring deer browse. And none of these methods are methods that we created. These are all methods that other universities, other people, the Forest Service have created to monitor deer browse. The four that we really looked at were twig aging, oak sentinel, browse surveys, and stump sprouts. And I'll talk more about those here in a minute. But we used deer density. So we measured deer density using manned aerial flights, as well as pellet counts, so counting deer poop, and infrared trail cameras across those landscapes to kind of predict deer densities. And then we use that deer density information and landscape characteristics to kind of predict what level of deer impact we might see. And some of the landscape characteristics we were looking at was, what is the vegetation types on the landscape? Is it all ag? Is it all forested? Is it a mix? And so on. And so we had a few papers that were published on this that kind of helped give us some clarity on how deer are impacting our forests and environments. That first paper there, kind of a few highlights that they found was that the twig age method was the best method that we had in Indiana to index deer impacts. And so I'll talk about how exactly to do the twig age, but basically the twig age method correlated really well with how much deer were browsing in woodlands. And then the impact of deer density on browsing was often overshadowed by landscape characteristic and non-native species within woodlands and within the landscape. So here's just a few examples of some of the browse monitoring methods we used. On the left here is stump sprouts, where we would create stump sprouts with a chainsaw, and we would cage half of them and leave half uncaged, and then we would just measure the difference between the height of the caged sprouts and the height of the uncaged sprouts to get an index of how much browsing was occurring. This method here in the middle is what's called the oak sentinel, and that's essentially where you plant oak seedlings inside of a fence and then also outside of a fence, and you look at the proportion of you look at the growth difference between the red oaks in the fence and then red oaks outside the fence. And then this last picture over here is an example of the twig age method. And this method works really well for ash seedlings as well as maple seedlings. And essentially what you're doing is you're trying to get an estimate of how long it's been since that twig has been browsed. So the older the twig is, the longer it's been since it's been browsed, and so the lower amount of deer impact you would have in a woodland. And what you're looking for are what are called terminal bud scale scars. And terminal bud scale scars are where new growth each year starts, and so you can kind of see the color difference between the newest year's growth and then the last year's growth here. And then these yellow lines also show other terminal bud scale scars, which usually are a kind of a scar that wraps all the way around the twig. And by counting those, so here we have 1, 2, 3, and then it connects to here, which is the last time it was browsed. So we would call that twig 5 years old, which means it's been 5 years since that twig was browsed. And so just kind of give you an understanding of how deer densities vary across Indiana. The left is the map of the areas we worked in, and then the right is deer density per kilometer squared, which I've changed to deer density per mile square. So any area that you see like very white or yellow, the deer density was really high at 31 deer per square mile or more. Excuse me. In any place you see like dark purple or almost black, it means the deer density was pretty low. And so this landscape here, where my cursor is where I am at Purdue in West Lafayette. This landscape over here is our southern Indiana landscape, and then this landscape over here is our northeast Indiana landscape. And as far as overall deer density, we had some of the highest deer densities in that northeast part of the state. Excuse me. And if you're interested in more about the deer population in Indiana, our Forest and Woodland Owners Association hosted a deer population webinar with our deer biologist, and you can scan the QR code or look at the YouTube video there. But for the purposes of today, what I kind of wanted to showcase was that what are the relationships between deer densities and deer impact? In Northeast Indiana, we had the highest deer impact overall. In some places, it was over 12 deer per kilometer squared or more than 31 deer per mile square. But we also had lower impacts to woodlands. We had older twig age. We had a higher wildflower herbaceous diversity than other areas. And the question is, that comes to my mind is why? And so I think it comes down to the fact that damage to the forest understory is not always correlated to deer density, but rather the interaction of deer density and the woodland and landscape characteristics. And what that research found was that with landscapes that had more food patches, things that deer could eat, or vegetation types where deer could find food, some shrubby areas, grasslands, meadows, herbaceous wetlands, pastures, hay fields, we had a reduced browse intensity or reduced impact. And in woodlots where we had a greater diversity of forbs and greater forb cover, we also had a reduced browse impact. So that kind of tells me that a diverse woodland and landscape with more food available to deer can sustain a higher deer density with lower deer impacts. And to kind of drive that point home, I kind of wanted to show you what the land cover looks like in these different regions. And so here's West Lafayette. Here's our very agricultural region. All the yellow is ag, and then all the purple is forested. And you can see this is the Wabash River here. The Wabash continues this way, and then this is the Tippecanoe River here. So most of our woodlands are associated most of our forests and woodlands are associated with river corridors or adjacent to river corridors. In the southern part of the state, we have a lot more forests, a lot less ag, but we still have a pretty homogeneous landscape in that we have lots of forest, especially lots of mature closed canopy forest, and not a lot of other vegetation types spread out through there, maybe some ag mixed in. But if you look at this kind of top one here, the Northeast Indiana, we have a mix of different vegetation types. So still dominated by row crop agriculture, but we have a fair amount of forest pockets spread throughout, grassy areas, wetlands, and other areas that kind of give us a nice diverse landscape. And that's where we had the highest deer density, but some of the lower deer impacts. This is just kind of a zoomed in view of it. And to kind of show you some results from that research on the left here, this is the probability that a woody species will be browsed based on how many food patches or the density of food patches in the landscape. So the more food patches you had, the more vegetation types you had in the landscape that could provide food for deer, the lower the probability that a species would be browsed. The same thing for the native herbaceous layer. The higher the percentage of the native herbaceous layer in a woodlot, the lower the probability of the browse. And this is an idea called managing the foodscape, which is essentially managing deer impact by providing more forage availability on the landscape. And so this graph here kind of shows you these shaded areas are different levels of deer impact. On the left here we have deer density, and then on the bottom here we have forage availability. This dashed line is basically a stable deer population, and this dotted line is an increasing deer population. So if we have a stable deer population, what we see is that if we have low forage availability, we may have high deer impacts, but as we increase the forage availability on the landscape, that impact is moderated by the amount of forage that's available. So, if we have high forage availability, lots of forest openings, lots of herbaceous cover, lots of grasslands and areas that deer can find food, then the impact those deer are having is spread out across the landscape, and it's less. It works the same way, but if we have an increasing deer population, it's hard to get away from those high or very high deer impacts. So along with managing the foodscape, you also need to think about how can you manage deer density. So just to kind of drive the point home with some pictures, which picture do you think has the highest deer the highest amount of deer food in it that a deer can access. The left picture or the right picture? All right, I'm getting mostly rights, which is good, right? So the picture on the right, we went out and actually measured how much deer food is there per acre, and it's around 500 to 600 pounds of deer forage, so things deer would eat per acre. The picture on the left, which is a closed canopy mature forest, there is about 50 pounds of deer forage per acre. So a substantial difference between the two pictures. And so we can think about how we manage our woods as a way to mitigate deer impacts. And so if you're interested in improving your woodland or your woods for deer, we have this publication that's also linked on that box link that I sent out. So we also had other research that looked at kind of how does plant availability in the woodlot impact deer browse? So we looked at selection rankings of woody species. So are some species selected versus avoided? And what we found was that deer really select for species like oaks, hackberry, viburnums, and dogwoods. They typically avoid most invasive species, and how they select species depends on on woodland factors. So one kind of important thing to mention as we talk about this from the results is essentially that if you look at how probable it is that a deer will browse multiflora rows, what you find is that probability, or deer are more likely to browse multiflora rows as the non-native stem density increases. So if you have a woodland that's dominated by native species, the likelihood that deer are going to browse multiflora rows is pretty low, but as you increase the invasive species in your woodland, the more likely you are to see browse on multiflora rows, which tells me that multiflora rows is one of the species that's often avoided but used as like an emergency food. And then you can see up there on the right some examples of what are highly selected versus slightly neutral, avoided, or highly avoided species. And I'll show you more examples of those later on. So does plant availability in a woodlot impact which plants deer browse? Absolutely. So a decline in selected species may indicate overbrowsing. So if deer are selectively eating black oak, red oak, and other species, they're going to create more room for things like bush honeysuckle or American beech to dominate the understory. Increased so it's the same thing, that increased browse rates on palatable native species may increase the abundance of avoided species. And reducing the abundance of avoided species like multiflora rows, bush honeysuckle may increase the quality of available food in your woodland. The last piece of research that I'll touch on relates to how do we manage deer impacts. And this is what's called a meta-analysis of research, which is basically a study of studies. So this study in particular looked at 99 different studies on techniques to mitigate deer browse across the eastern United States, and they looked at which ones work and which ones may not. There's the list of different methods that they looked at, and we'll come back to those here in a minute. So just a visual representation of some of those methods. So we have fencing here, and then tree tubes on the right here. A couple other examples. This would be an example of a slash fence. Here would be an example of what's called plant facilitation, where you use other plant species, a lot of times things with thorns like brambles, to kind of hide the regeneration you want to keep. And then this picture down the bottom is a combination of techniques where we use a timber harvest to increase the amount of light, but also put tree shelters on oak species that we knew deer would really like to browse. So just kind of go over what they found. The graph on the left here shows you the probability a hardwood seedling is browsed. And basically, to interpret this graph, what you want to look at is if the bar is below this zero line, that means that this technique reduced deer browse. If the bar is above the zero line, it means that it actually increased deer browse. And then if it straddles this line here, it means that there was no effect they could determine whereas in some studies maybe it has a positive impact, and some studies it had a negative impact. So what we want are these negative values in this one. So fencing, caging, and sheltering trees, hardwoods, seedlings, reduced deer browse. Unsurprising. But so did population control, plant facilitation, and repellents. But if we look at fertilization, fertilizing the trees actually made deer browse them more. So it may be kind of counterintuitive to fertilize trees. The thought is you could fertilize trees to get them to grow fast enough outside of deer's reach, but by fertilizing them, you kind of make them more selective to deer. This one in the middle is hardwood tree survival. So things like caging them increased hardwood survival. Harvesting, so harvesting would be like doing a timber harvest, increased hardwood seedling survival, as did fencing and putting mesh sleeves on. As far as growth, the methods that increased growth were plant facilitation, fencing, sheltering, and then caging, all increased hardwood seedling growth. So moving from research to management, so the whole concept around this deer impact toolbox was to take that research that's been done in Indiana, but also done in several other kind of Midwestern and Eastern states, and distill it down to resources to help landowners and managers address deer impacts. And that's kind of the goal of this deer impact toolbox, which is 4 publications and 3 monitoring method videos, which are all research-based. So to think about this toolbox, it's important to think about what are the steps to address deer impacts. First, we have to understand the problem, which we kind of just went over what the problem is, so hopefully you have a better understanding of deer impacts and the problem. But then we have to have to identify the signs and symptoms of deer impacts in our woodlands. And that would be first starting off by looking at how do you even tell a rabbit browse from deer browse? It may seem kind of easy to think about, easy to do, but I get a fair amount of calls from landowners that send me pictures of what they think is deer browse, which actually turns out to be rabbit browse. So deer lack upper incisors, and so because of that, when they make their bite mark, they have a very torn and tattered looking bite mark. Rabbits have upper incisors and lower incisors, and so when they browse something, they make a clean 45-degree cut. And you may not think that rabbits can do much damage, but we have a research property in eastern Indiana where we have about 20 acres of 2-year-old tree plantings, and the rabbits have done a number of damage across that tree planting. And we're able to determine it was rabbits based on the browsing patterns. We also need to think about what do deer like to eat. And so I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation here, and I want you to look at that list and think about which plants do you think deer would really like to eat, which ones they select, and you can just type them into the chat here. Red and black oaks. Yep, that's one of them. Any other ones that deer would really like to eat? Oak, dogwood. All right. How about species that? And then in this category, we're only talking about them browsing the twigs of these species, not eating the mast. Greenbrier. Okay. How about species that deer would avoid eating if given the choice? Multiflora rose, honeysuckle, autumn olive, beech. Those are all really good answers. So here's how it shakes out based on our research data that we have in Indiana. Northern red oak, greenbriers, and dogwoods, very high on the list. Ohio buckeyes, black cherry are on the kind of neutral list, means they don't select them or avoid them. And then bush honeysuckle, spice bush, beech, multiflora rose, autumn olive, and black walnut are actually all on the avoided side. Now, keep in mind that deer browse selection can change in different areas, and so this is what we saw in Indiana, which may be a little bit different than what you might see in Illinois or other states. And so this is that Same list I showed you earlier that has more species that are selected and avoided. And so you can see species like ironwood, coralberry, spicebush pawpaw on the avoided list, and then a lot of our species that we would consider quote unquote timber species are on that highly selected or slightly selected list. Hence why deer can cause issues with regeneration. So we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it with wildflowers and kind of herbaceous species. So which species on this list do you think deer would like to eat? I've given you a few answers if you were paying attention earlier. All right, trillium, good. Trillium is high on the list. All right, how about species that they'd like to avoid if given the chance? Garlic mustard, all right. You all got my freebies that I gave you earlier. So on the selected side are species like trillium, jewelweed, Canada mayflower, and sweet Cicely. On the kind of neutral side are wood sorrel, clearweed, and wingstem. And then on the avoided side are garlic mustard, jack in the pulpit, and then Dutchman's breeches. And there's a much longer list of these species in some of the publications that I'll talk about here in a minute. So once we kind of understand the problem and have identified the problem, we can think about how do we assess our woodland from a standpoint of deer impacts. And so inside the publications that I'll reference here in a minute is this deer impact assessment questionnaire. And basically you could walk through all these questions, you'd get a score after walking through all the questions, and then based on your score, it would give you kind of a very coarse look at if you have a deer problem or if deer aren't really causing an issue in your woodland. Once you kind of walk through that questionnaire, you can go into how to actually monitor deer and deer browse. It's really important to think about how you can monitor deer browse in your woodland to get an understanding of what deer are eating and how much of it they're eating. So there's lots of available methods. General Browse Survey. There's a method from New York called the AVID, or the Assessing Vegetation Impacts from Deer method, which has a nice online portal to enter data. And then there's several other methods we talked about. So a similar graphic that we showed you earlier. And then what we found was that twig aging was the best for Indiana. So the one here on the right. And this is kind of just a closer look at how you might age a twig. So here is that terminal bud scale scar where you have a scar wrapping all the way around the stem, or the twig, sorry. And then this is what's called a leaf scar, which is just one little scar that doesn't wrap all the way around the twig. And so you're counting these terminal bud scale scars. And I don't have time to go in today exactly how you do it, but I will tell you that there's a protocol in these resources to tell you how to implement twig aging in your woodland. So you, through our research and through different things that we've done at Purdue, we have developed kind of scores that tell you how the level of intensity of browse in your woodland. And so what we found was that if you have a twig age that's less than 2 years old, on average in your woodland, you have high browse intensity. If you have low browse intensity, your twig age is probably more in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 years old. Now, I will tell you that these values are probably most applicable to Indiana because that's where the research was done. And the farther you get away from landscape differences in Indiana, the less likely these actual values are accurate. But the important thing to think here is that if you have a lower twig age, you have a higher browse intensity. If you have a higher twig age, you have a lower browse intensity. So once we've kind of monitored the problem and identified if deer are an issue, we think about what management options exist and which ones actually work. So we have things like population control, so hunting, fencing, tree shelters and cages, slash fences, plant protection, which is that plant facilitation, habitat management, repellents, and then you can also combine methods. This is just an example of several of those methods that we've kind of already covered. So what the research found, and this is a graph that comes out of the publications that I'll introduce you to here in a minute, is that, and this is that same graph I showed you earlier, but we flipped it. So the higher the bar is, the better that method is at reducing deer browse. So the best methods were fencing, sheltering, caging, and then reducing the deer population. And then methods that were also effective, but maybe less so, were plant protection, so allowing other plants around your desired regeneration to protect them, and then repellents. In general, slash fencing wasn't effective, and that's not to say that it's not effective overall, but there was a lot of variation in the data. So some studies found it wasn't effective, and some studies found it was effective. And so this is just another shot at a site where we use timber harvest to open up the canopy to allow more sunlight for oaks, and tree tubes as a way to reduce deer browse. And so once you've kind of done your management, you need to think about how effective was that management over time. So with the monitoring methods, it's not necessarily just a one and done type activity. It's something that you need to kind of come back to every now and then in your woodland to really get a gauge on how things like twig age changes over time, right? So if your woodland starts out at a twig age of 1.5, that tells you that there's a lot of deer impact in there. But through your management, if you come back 5 years later and remeasure the twig age, and it's all the way up to 4, that tells you that whatever your management did is probably working, right? You've reduced the overall deer impacts. And so those are generally those kind of 5 steps to addressing deer impacts. And this kind of leads me to just a brief overview of what the resources within the deer impact toolbox are. And so we have 4 publications that kind of walk you through all of those steps to addressing deer impacts. And they're split up into kind of an introduction to whitetail deer impacts, understanding deer and how they impact environment, the Indiana woodlands, monitoring deer impacts, and then managing deer impacts. And the titles all say Indiana in them because we produce this with the Nature Conservancy of Indiana, but a lot of the information is very transferable, especially within the Midwest where we have pretty similar landscapes. We also have monitoring method videos. So those methods for monitoring, the videos are really how-to videos on how to do them. We don't have one up for twig aging yet, but we have one for the avid method and then the 10 tallest method. And if you want to find all of those publications and videos, you can use that link that Chris dropped in the chat, or you can scan these QR codes. And if you want more information about some of the resources that are coming out of Purdue related to a variety of forestry and natural resources topics, you can scan this code here to subscribe to our Got Nature newsletter. So I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the folks that helped fund this project, but also all the co-authors, reviewers, and then researchers on the research. So I used we a lot when talking about the research. The we is really these folks down here in a collection of others. So with that, I think I've left plenty of time for questions. And this is my shameless plug, that if you're interested in more kind of wildlife habitat management information, myself and another specialist from Iowa State have a podcast called Habitat University that covers a lot of habitat management specific resources and information.